Okay, let's go ahead and check out this final lesson video of the 2017-2018 school year. And in this lesson video, we're going to talk about the Cold War flashpoints. So what this means are the kind of main events during the Cold War where the United States and Soviet Union nearly went to war. So a flashpoint is like like a near miss where they could have gone to war, but somehow didn't. So let's go ahead and this is your title slide. So this is just a preview. You don't have to take notes on this one, but let's go ahead and take a look at what the flashpoints that we're going to cover. We're going to talk about things like the space race, the Vietnam War, the Korean War, how the United States and Soviet Union kind of bring the Cold War into the Olympics. What's going to happen during this time? China is going to become communist too, and that's going to kind of freak out the United States. Like, oh my God, these two gigantic countries in Asia and Europe are now both communists, so they're going to team up against us. As well, we're going to find out, even though both Soviet Union and China are both communists, they don't really get along. They have different ideas of how things should be done. So it doesn't end up being like they're ever going to team up against us. But at this time, that was kind of a very scary proposition that, China is a communist. Now, who's next? I mean, the world's going to team up against us. So this led to kind of like feelings of paranoia, both by the United States and also by Soviet Union. So let's go ahead and jump into this. So the first flashpoint we're going to talk about here is the Korean War. I call this hashtag stuck in the middle. Now, when I say stuck in the middle, there's a movie that comes to mind when I think that stuck in the middle. The Korean people are stuck in the middle of this. Pretty much is that you have the capitalists, the United States, versus the communists, the Soviet Union. And when World War II was over, the communists took control of North Korea, and the capitalists, which was us, took control of South Korea. Now, when I say stuck in the middle, it reminds me of the movie Collateral Damage, starring Arnold Schwarzenegger. And in this movie, there's this kind of guy who you would call a terrorist who, he's angry at the United States and he wants to make a message and to the United States government, and he sets off a bomb, and the innocent son of Arnold Schwarzenegger is killed. So, we call that collateral damage. People who are kind of stuck in the middle that kind of suffer because of two larger forces competing over something. They're kind of stuck in the middle and they suffer. We call that collateral damage. So long story short, the Koreans were stuck in the middle. So the Korean War, again, begins at the end of World War II. The United States has the South. North Korea is mainly controlled by the communists in the Soviet Union. So the Korean War still hasn't really stopped, but it's going to begin in the late 1940s, but officially in 1950. If we look at this kind of these little maps here, it kind of goes over what the Korean War is. Quick overview. So at the end of World War II, you would have the North, again, like I've said before, controlled by the communists. They're going to come in and attack the capitalist South, to the point where they're going to overrun the capitalist and United States back south to this only little area right here at the bottom of the Korean Peninsula is all they have left. It's a quick attack, and they're overrun, and it takes the United States and some allies some time before they're able to push them back. So by the end of that year, General right here, Douglas MacArthur, who we talked about in World War II, the architect of the whole island hopping program, it's his job to take this territory back and push them back in North Korea and possibly even unite Korea under capitalism and democracy. So after they rally from only having this left, they push the North Korean troops back, and they pretty much are almost pushing them out of North Korea into China. We used a lot of air attacks and bombing, and really took it to North Korea. Now, General MacArthur, this dude, some people were a little scared of the guy. They thought he was kind of a loose cannon, because he was even talking about, hey, let's use nuclear weapons and bomb the living crap out of the northern part of North Korea, so that will scare anybody from trying to invade Korea again. And eventually the plug got pulled on that idea, and he got relieved of command because he wasn't really following orders, and that never came. Luckily, that never really came to light that we were going to use nuclear weapons. But he did. He is known for wanting to use nuclear weapons against the North Korean soldiers and any of the Chinese and Russian soldiers that were backing them up. But eventually, we pushed him back to this river right here, the Yalu River, which is near their border with China. And when we get there, there's hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers staring at us, backing up North Korea. So we're thinking we're all bad, we're doing really well, but then because we run into that force of Chinese soldiers helping North Korea, they push us back to the halfway point across the Korean Peninsula, which is we know as the 38th parallel. So if you were to zoom in here, this is a line that pretty much goes across the Korean Peninsula, and you have the north on the top, south at the bottom. And since then, there's been what we call a ceasefire. They call it, other times they call it the armistice line, but there was a ceasefire, and they still have their guns pointed at each other, but nobody has shot since the 1950s, and the conflict really hasn't been resolved. But as we know right now, it's scheduled to be this summer. President Trump is supposed to meet with Kim Jong-un, and this could be some history in the making, where we can maybe finally see a reconciliation between the North and South Korea, and maybe we don't have to worry about all the crazy stuff we hear in the news anymore. So long story short, Korean War was again. The Koreans are stuck in the middle. It's the U.S. versus the Russians. The Russians and the Communist Chinese are backing up the North. We got the South. The North attacks. We protect the South. We push them out. And then we get pushed back. And eventually we decide, let's kind of go back to the way things were, half and half. Our next flashpoint is the Cuban Missile Crisis. So if you're in my class, then you have a pretty good idea of what this was like watching the movie 13 Days. I call this hashtag Biggie versus Pac, or Biggie versus Tupac. Now, what we learned from the movie 13 Days was that the Soviet Union started putting nuclear missiles in Cuba, 90 miles away from the United States, with the capability of striking virtually the entire country and killing millions and millions of Americans. Now, this is a really bold move, a very bold move, and it reminds me a little bit of the rivalry between Tupac and Biggie. Now, during the height of this rivalry, before they were both killed, Biggie's doing a show over in California. That's Tupac. Tupac was West Coast. California's West Coast. That's Tupac's backyard. And he's going to come do a show in Tupac's backyard. And people are booing him because they're Tupac supporters. They went there just to boo him. And they're booing him. And he does a famous song called Who Shot Ya?, which people thought that was taking a shot at Tupac. And he still sang the song, got booed off stage, and it was a real mess. This reminds me of the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the Russians are like, well, we're going to go right into your backyard, and we're going to antagonize you. The same way that Biggie kind of antagonized Tupac supporters in his own backyard, the Russians are going to go right to our backyard, which is Cuba, 90 miles away. It's like our backyard, and they're going to put nuclear weapons. So this really, I saw a great similarity between Tupac and Biggie with the Cuban Missile Crisis. So this all starts a couple years before the crisis. It starts in a very infamous event in our history called the Bay of Pigs. Now, if we look here at the map, the Bay of Pigs is located right here on the southern coast of Cuba. And what had happened, President Kennedy, one of the first things he did as president, before he heroically handled the Cuban Missile Crisis, he kind of helped create it. Now, we knew that Cuba, that their leader, for this dude right here, Fidel Castro, was buddy-buddy with the Soviet Union and their leader, Nikita Khrushchev. And what's going to happen, he says, hey, we're going to be communists just like the Soviet Union, And of course, Kennedy's like, dude, we can't have that. We can't have communists in our backyard. You know, that's a threat to us. This is our yard. We should have capitalists, democracy, all of our neighbors. We shouldn't have communists. So Kennedy is advised by his generals, say, hey, if we can send a small force to land in the Bay of Pigs, we're going to tell the people, hey, Castro's bad. He sucks. We're going to help you. Let's rise up and throw him out. And they convince Kennedy, hey, this will work. We can get Castro out, and we can get somebody in there who is friendly to the United States, not the Soviet Union, and rebuild Cuba in our own image, kind of like what we did with Japan and with Germany. So Kennedy okays it, but it's an epic fail. It did not work. Some of our soldiers and commanders who went in there to start this whole revolution, they get kidnapped. Some of them died. And the people just did not join it. They were too afraid to join and rise up against Castro. So Castro's like, oh crap, the United States just tried to kick me out of power. So that's going to make the relationship with the Soviet Union stronger. So pretty much, you know, if you connect the dots here, the Soviet Union said, all right, well, you know what? Let's teach those Americans a lesson. Let's give Castro, we're going to put some nuclear missiles in Cuba. And maybe that will scare the United States from ever trying to invade Cuba again. And guess what? It worked. We've never invaded Cuba. They're still communist. You know, Castro's government lives on. Now, pretty much, think of it this way. It all starts because Castro's like, hey, help Russia, save us from those American bullies. And those nuclear weapons that were put in Cuba, that we caught them, that they lied about, pretty much did the trick. We stopped bullying them. We have our issues with them. Things are getting better with Cuba, but you know, the whole Cuban Missile Crisis with the Russians putting those missiles in Cuba was a response to our failed attempt at kicking Castro out in the Bay of Pigs. So, long story short, this is like Biggie versus Tupac. You had Biggie, who goes in Tupac's backyard and is getting a little controversial. The same way that the Soviet Union goes into our backyard, Cuba, and is going to be very controversial. I mean, it's pretty much hard. You can't be any more controversial than nuclear weapons. So similarities there, pretty strong. Our next flashpoint here is the Vietnam War. Call this hashtag AvengersAge of Ultron. Now, the Vietnam War was an unofficial war. The way war works here in the United States, the president can ask Congress to declare war. Until Congress agrees, we never go to war. Now, the president can order some strikes against a target, but to be full-blown war, Congress has to agree. Well, the Vietnam War never really was a war because Congress never agreed to it. And a number of U.S. presidents sent troops, thousands and thousands of troops to Vietnam, but we were never officially at war. Now, what's going to happen during the Cold War, a lot of countries start falling under the spell of the Soviet Union and communism. And we saw China do it. And eventually we look at the rest of Asia like, this is going to be a domino effect. After China, who's next? So if you look at this graphic here, Vietnam, their neighbors Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Burma, India, Bangladesh, all these countries throughout Asia, we were afraid would fall like dominoes under the spell of Soviet Union and communism. So we're going to start sending soldiers over there to kind of prevent that from happening, to prevent the dominoes from falling. This is very similar to what happened in the movie Avengers Age of Ultron. You know, we tried to prevent the dominoes from falling before it ever happened. In the movie Avengers Age of Ultron, Tony Stark, aka Iron Man, he creates Ultron, this computer program that would replace all the Avengers with all the knowledge of the world and the powers that could replace the Avengers from ever having to do their work again. It's going to kind of create a solution to a problem that hasn't even happened yet. He's thinking too far ahead. So it's very similar to what happens in Vietnam. We're afraid, we're trying to look ahead to what might happen and try to stop before it does happen. Now, because this was an unofficial war, it's possibly the most unpopular war in our country's history. Now, the Vietnam War, again, very similar to North Korea. You have the North Vietnam, controlled by the communists, and so backed up by the Soviet Union with some Chinese help. And then you have the South, which is backed up by the United States, and they're capitalists. Well, North invades South. We help the South. We fight back. It goes back and forth for years and years and years. There's no real winner, no official winner. The United States, we had gone for over a decade of sending soldiers over there and fighting and killing millions of them, thousands of us dying in this endless war that we pretty much gave up. It was so unpopular that the public did not support it. We eventually said, hey, we might as well just give up on it. We didn't really lose, but we just kind of quit. We're like, yeah, we're tired. They didn't beat us. If we really, really wanted to, if we had the country's support, we probably could have put enough effort to really winning the war, but we didn't have it. At this time, there's a lot of civil unrest in our country, and the fighting for civil rights especially between blacks and whites. We had a lot of black soldiers go over there, and a lot of black people in America were like, hey, why are we going to go fight for a country that disrespects us? So, for example, here we have a very interesting sign right here. If you look at that, I'm not going to read it, but I know you guys can read. But this is a very interesting sign here that, why are we going to go fight the Vietnamese? They never called us this horrible word. But at the same time, the same country that we're supposed to fight for, we get called this word all the time. So this just highlights how unpopular the war was. We have other protesters here protesting, saying, hey, Vietnam's for the Vietnamese. Let's get other. Let's let them solve their own problem. Why are we going over there? Again, the reason why we're trying to prevent this domino effect from happening. Okay, so again, we have all these different examples here of protests. And again, the whole reason, even though it was a very unpopular war, we think that we can stop this horrible thing from happening before it happens. Same thing in the movie Avengers Age of Ultron. Tony Stark is trying to prevent a horrible attack before it happens, and it ends up blowing up in his face. So, long story short, the Vietnam War, okay, we're trying to stop all these countries from falling under the spell of the Soviet Union and communism. And we see it coming, but eventually we try to stop it before it happens, and it blows up in our face. We end up turning a lot of our own citizens turn against the army, turn against the country. So in this picture right here, you actually have veterans who come back from fighting who are against it. Like, dude, we went over there and fought for no damn reason. It's ridiculous. So long story short, like Avengers Age of Ultron, we try to prevent something from happening, it blows up in our face. That simple. Now, Vietnam did fall under the spell of communism, but all these other countries, for the most part, did not. Vietnam did, but the rest of them didn't. So you could say that maybe this was a success. These countries saw, hey, if we get involved with the Soviet Union, we turn to communism, then the United States gets involved. They didn't want that to happen. Who knows? Long story short, the domino effect never really happened. But the fact that we tried to stop it did, in many ways, blow up in our face. Our next flashpoint is the space race. Hashtag rush hour. So we're going to watch this little video clip here, because this is going to, from the movie Rush Hour, and it's going to really highlight kind of what the space race was.
Your daddy was a policeman?
15 years LAPD.
My father was also a policeman.
Your daddy was a cop?
Not a cop. An officer. A legend. All over Hong Kong.
My daddy a legend too, all over America. My daddy wants to arrest 15 people in one night by himself.
My daddy arrested 25 by himself.
My daddy saved 5 crackheads from a burning building by himself.
My daddy once caught a bullet with his bare hands.
My daddy kick your daddy's ass all the way from here to China, Japan, wherever the hell you from, and all up that Great Wall, too.
Don't talk about my father.
Don't talk about my daddy.
Okay, so in this movie, obviously in this clip, you see Lee and Carter are trying to one-up each other. Well, my daddy did this. My daddy did that. That's kind of really what the space race was. Soviet Union said, hey, we're going to do this. The United States, well, we're going to try this. So instead of going back and forth, it started off very one-sided. The space race, at the beginning, was being dominated by the Soviet Union. They were the first country to put a lot of things in space. They put the first satellite ever called Sputnik. It's a picture of what it looks like. It looks kind of like a little alien, but it wasn't very big. But it was the first satellite to orbit Earth. The Russians did it. They put the first living being, this dog right here called Laika. The first human being to go in orbit, Yuri Gagarin. They put the first woman in space. The first 2- and 3-man flight into outer space. They were the first ones to ever do that. We were getting our butts kicked. But we go back to the movie Rush Hour when they're trying to go back and forth and see who's better. The United States does make a comeback and eventually wins the space race because, yeah, they put a person in space. We got the first person to actually orbit the entire planet in outer space. No one, the Russians never did that. We did that first. We were the first country to put people, and the only country to put human beings on the moon. Here we have the first man on the moon, Neil Armstrong. A few minutes later, his buddy Buzz Aldrin also got to walk on the moon. They're the first 2 human beings to walk on the moon. So here's a picture of Neil Armstrong right here. And here we have another one of Neil Armstrong kind of standing in front of a giant photo of himself planting the flag of the United States on the moon. So the fact that we got people on the moon gave us the ultimate victory. Yeah, the Russians got a lot of things done first. We pretty much, they did it, so we copied them, but they were like, haha, US, we're first. But then when it came to the big stuff, we pretty much dominated and won the space race. The space race, what got us to the moon was the famous Apollo missions, flying these Apollo rockets, which pretty much the whole thing is all rocket, and the very tip up here is where the astronauts would be flying. But that's what it took to get somebody into outer space, into the moon. In the 1980s, actually, when I was a kid, right after the first 3 Star Wars movies came out, President Reagan comes up with this idea called the Star Wars Defense System, where we're still worried that the Soviet Union might try to shoot nuclear missiles at us. So he starts getting funding for developing these like lasers that will be shot from like satellites in outer space that can shoot down any missiles headed our way. So again, we took the space race to a whole new level. We invented the space shuttle, which are still being used up until very recently. So yeah, it started off the Soviet Union. They would do it. We were always second. Then eventually we took the lead and never ever looked back. The last and final slide for this lesson video is called détente and the end. Let's focus on this word right here. It's a French word. It looks like détente. It's pronounced détente. So say that in your head really quickly. Détente. Now détente, what this means, it's a French word for that pretty much means that we don't want to fight. We're not at peace. We haven't come to an agreement, but we want to find like a truth, kind of like a ceasefire. We're still arguing with you, but we don't want to get into a fight. That's pretty much what détente is. But we're going to look for a diplomatic solution instead of a physical solution. So this slide, I'm going to use hashtag #BigBadWolfSmoking. So if you're not sure what that means, let's take a look at this little short commercial right here and focus on the big bad wolf. We know the big bad wolf, he's going to huff, he's going to puff, he's going to blow the pig's house down. And see how the pigs are all scared. But watch what happens to the big bad wolf and you'll know what I mean.
Smoking as a teen can permanently stunt your lungs, taking the air out of even the biggest and baddest.
So we're going to come back to that video in a second. So after years of nearly going to blows with the Soviet Union, in Korea, Cuba, Vietnam. You know, we decided, we're getting too close. Eventually, we're going to get to the point where we're going to have nuclear war. And neither country really wanted that. So we started coming up with these different ways to talk about things. Let's come up with treaties and agreements rather than getting really, really close to war where just one slip is going to lead one of the countries to dropping nuclear bombs. So one of the first evidence of détente was what we call the SALT Treaty, which stands for the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, which means that we're going to limit the amount of nuclear weapons we have. We're actually going to stop trying to produce a whole bunch of as many as we can. For years, we were trying to get more and more nuclear weapons because we knew they had nuclear weapons, and we wanted to have more than them because that would scare them from ever trying to use theirs against us. So the SALT Treaty helped kind of like limit, if we look at this table here, the amount of nuclear weapons that each country had. And we both agreed, okay, here's what we have. Let's slow down. Let's stop. Let's slowly eventually start dismantling some of these because we have enough nuclear weapons here between the two of us to destroy all life on Earth many times over. So Détente, again, was all about making those deals to kind of prevent an actual fight. Because if we go back to the way we were doing things, all these flashpoints, we were getting very close. And we were very lucky that we never really got into a real fight. As the 1980s kicked on, the whole rivalry, the Cold War, spread into athletics, into the Olympics. And in 1980, the capital of the Soviet Union, Moscow, hosted the Olympics. But the United States, we are not sending our athletes to participate in the Olympics in the Soviet Union for all those communists. We can't do it. So we did not participate in the 1980 Summer Olympics. 1984, Los Angeles is the host city, and the Soviet Union does not send their athletes to the United States, kind of like as a revenge. You're not going to come to us, we're not going to you. So this led people thinking, hey, maybe this détente's not a bad idea, I guess. You can think of it this way. If we're going to fight the Cold War, let's fight it with maybe these disagreements over sports. It's much safer than actually having to go to war or nearly go to war like we had done in Cuba, in Vietnam, and Korea. As the 80s moved on, a new man became in charge of the Soviet Union. They don't have a president. But he was the leader of the Soviet Union. Was called the General Secretary. So Mikhail Gorbachev, this dude right here, kind of bald guy shaking President Reagan's hand, he becomes General Secretary of the Soviet Union, and he comes up with these two new kind of ideas for the Soviet Union for their future. He calls them glasnost and perestroika. And these two ideas are about making the Soviet Union more open to the rest of the world. When I say open, they were always open, but they were going to say, hey, we're the Soviet Union. You guys do things like us. They're more about, let's learn from each other. Let's open ourselves up to other ideas, and maybe the United States isn't that bad. Maybe we should learn from them, and maybe they can learn from us, and maybe that's a way that we can talk things over instead of coming nearly close to killing each other. So the ideas of glasnost and perestroika are trying to open them up to have a dialogue with the rest of the world instead of trying to impose their will on everybody else, including us. So as time goes on, during Gorbachev's time as General Secretary of the Soviet Union, the countries that Stalin had originally kind of gobbled up to build that buffer zone between himself and Germany, who became little versions of the Soviet Union, they start breaking away and say, hey, we don't want to be like the Soviet Union. We want to be like the United States. So all these countries that they surrounded themselves with start breaking away. And one of those countries was East Germany. In East Germany, you had the Berlin Wall. And in 1989, I remember being 8 years old and seeing this on the news, the Berlin Wall finally goes down. And Germans can go back and forth across Berlin and be reunited with friends and family they hadn't seen in nearly 40 years. So because of the new ideas brought by the Soviet Union's General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev, these ideas of glasnost and perestroika, they're going to open the Soviet Union and countries who are aligned with the Soviet Union, they're going to open them up to new ideas of, hey, maybe we can be like the United States. 2 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Soviet Union officially comes to an end, and it's renamed as Russia. And they begin to have democracy and voting and the rights that we have. So you can pretty much, long story short, say the United States won the Cold War. We had to pretty much wait them out. But what does that have to do with the big bad wolf smoking? Well, we were very much afraid of the Soviet Union. We knew they had all these nuclear weapons, and like the pigs in the story of in the Three Little Pigs, the Big Bad Wolf, we were scared of them. But when it came down to it, they really weren't as scary as we had thought they were. Like in the commercial there, he's gonna huff and puff and he blows, and they're like, "What? Really? That's it?" And then all of a sudden they start walking around. Okay, yeah, you're not that scary after all. In the end, as the Soviet Union opened themselves up, we realized, yeah, they looked pretty scary, but really they weren't as powerful and as strong as we thought they were. They came across that way, but in reality, they really weren't that strong. So for 50 years after World War II, our ally during the war, Soviet Union, we have this Cold War for 50 years, and finally, I remember being about 10, 11 years old when this happens, it's over. And the Soviet Union is no more.